Bohr stared at the tiny bundle wrapped in reindeer skin, wondering how a newborn could survive when the wind screamed at -40 degrees Celsius and the ground was a crust of ice. The answer lies not in magic, but in a suite of clever strategies that Ice Age peoples honed over millennia, all backed by archaeological finds and ethnographic analogs. First, the very act of keeping the baby close to a heat source was essential. Cave sites from the Upper Paleolithic, such as the famous Grotte des Pigeons in France, contain clusters of hearth ash surrounded by compacted animal skins, suggesting family groups gathered around a central fire. Parents would cradle infants against their own bodies, using the natural insulation of a thick fur coat. The heat from the adult's core, amplified by a woolen or hide-wrapped baby carrier, could raise the infant's microenvironment by 10 degrees or more, enough to stave off hypothermia. Second, the choice of birthing location mattered. Evidence from the Kostanky 14 site in Russia shows that mothers often selected natural shelters, caves, overhangs, or snowdrift hollows, where wind was blocked and ambient temperature was a few degrees higher than the open steppe. These spots also allowed a fire to be kept burning continuously, something archaeologists infer from the presence of fire-cracked stones and soot residues in deep, undisturbed layers. Nutrition was another lifesaver. While modern infants rely on breast milk, Ice Age women likely produced richer, higher-fat milk thanks to their diet of marrow-rich megafauna and fatty fish. Stable isotope analysis of ancient dental calculus indicates a protein-dense diet, which translates into more caloric milk. Some researchers even suggest that mothers might have supplemented with pre-milk from the first few days, a thick, antibody-laden secretion that bolsters a newborn's immune system against the harsh pathogens lurking in cold, damp caves. Protection from predators was built into the communal structure. In sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dozens of adult skeletons are found together, implying a tight-knit group that could collectively defend a vulnerable infant. The presence of stone tools with wear patterns consistent with butchering large mammals also indicates that the group could quickly procure fresh meat, ensuring both food security and the ability to ward off wolves or hyenas that might be drawn by a baby's cries. Finally, cultural practices helped. Ethnographic studies of modern Arctic peoples, such as the Inuit, reveal rituals of skin lining, where a newborn is placed in a shallow pit lined with moss, animal hide, and a layer of heated stones. While we have no direct evidence of identical rituals in the Ice Age, the recurring pattern of deep hearth pits and layered insulation in sites across Europe and Siberia strongly suggests a comparable method. These pits not only kept the baby warm, but also provided a dry, insulated surface that prevented the dangerous loss of body heat through conduction to the frozen ground. So, when you picture a tiny hand gripping a mother's fur-clad shoulder while a fire crackles nearby, you're actually visualizing a life-saving combination of body heat, clever shelter choice, nutrient-rich milk, group defense, and ancient baby warmers that allowed Ice Age infants to pull through even the coldest of winters. How could a hunter-gatherer keep his core temperature up when the wind was howling at -40 degrees and the ground was a slab of ice? The answer isn't a high-tech parka, it's the clever use of living insulation that ancient people fashioned from animal skins, feathers, and even compacted snow. When a mammoth or bison fell, the first thing the band would do was strip the hide while the meat was still warm. The thick dermal layer, full of subcutaneous fat, was then carefully split into panels, sewn together with sinew, and draped over the body like a blanket. Because the fat remained intact, it acted like a natural thermal valve. It stored heat generated by the muscles and released it slowly, preventing the sudden drop in skin temperature that leads to frostbite. Experiments with reconstructed hide cloaks show they can retain up to 70% of body heat for several hours, even when the ambient temperature is well below freezing. But the skin wasn't the only layer. Archaeologists have found evidence of layered clothing: a base layer of fur-lined bark or woven grass, a middle layer of hide, and an outer shell of water-repellent animal hide treated with animal fat. The outermost layer shed snow and moisture, keeping the inner layers dry, a principle still used in modern outdoor gear. In addition to clothing, ancient peoples used snow itself as insulation. In the harshest winters, they dug shallow pits in the snow, lined them with animal skins and furs, and curled up inside. The snow walls acted like a massive, low-conductivity blanket, trapping the body heat that radiated upward. Similar snow houses have been documented at sites like the Yana River in Siberia, dating to about 32,000 years ago, where researchers found the remains of compacted snow walls coated with a thin layer of animal fat to prevent melt-through. The strategy was always about creating a microenvironment where the temperature gradient was as small as possible. By wrapping themselves in multiple layers of skin and adding a snow wall, they reduced heat loss by conduction and convection dramatically. This living insulation allowed them not just to survive, but to stay active enough to hunt, craft tools, and tend to the sick even in the deepest freeze. Scientists believe this multi-layered approach was a universal adaptation among Upper Paleolithic groups across Europe, Siberia, and North America, a testament to human ingenuity long before any synthetic fabric ever existed. How could a single spark keep a family warm through a whole winter month when the temperature outside hovered at -40 degrees? The answer lies in a surprisingly simple trick that prehistoric people discovered long before any of us ever saw a lighter. A carefully prepared flint and pyrite fire starter combined with a bundle of dry tinder that could be reignited again and again, turning a fleeting spark into a reliable, month-long heat source. Scientists believe that Upper Paleolithic groups, especially those living in the frigid steppes of Central Asia and the icy caves of Western Europe, harvested high-quality flint nodules and pieces of pyrite, iron sulfide that shatters with a bright, hot spark when struck. The key was not just the raw materials, but the way they treated the tinder. Archaeologists have uncovered charred remnants of plant fibers, inner bark, and even the dried husks of grass species like Stipa and Festuca. These fibers were first pre-charred in low-oxygen fires, a process that removes moisture and creates a slow-burning, almost ember-like material that can be relit with a single spark for many days. The process went like this. A small, shallow pit was dug into the ground or lined with stone, then filled with a layer of the pre-charred tinder. A piece of flint was struck against pyrite, sending a hot spark onto the tinder. Once the tinder caught, it glowed steadily, and the fire was carefully fed with additional dry brush, animal hide scraps, or even the fat rendered from fresh carcasses. Crucially, the prehistoric fire maker would never let the blaze burn to full flame. Instead, they kept it smoldering, covering it with a thin layer of ash or a shallow stone lid. This smoldering core retained heat for hours, and when the night grew cold, a single strike of flint would revive the ember, turning it back into a usable flame. Evidence from sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and the Kostenky settlements along the Don River shows ash lenses and charred layers that are unusually thick for a short campfire, suggesting deliberate maintenance of a long-lasting ember bank. Moreover, residue analysis of stone tools reveals microscopic flecks of iron sulfide, confirming repeated flint pyrite strikes. Researchers have even recreated these techniques in experimental archaeology labs, finding that a well-prepared tinder bundle can stay alight for up to 30 days with minimal fuel, provided it's shielded from wind and moisture. Why was this trick so revolutionary? First, it meant that families could stay in one place for weeks, storing meat and hides in a semi-permanent shelter without the constant need to hunt for fresh firewood. Second, a reliable heat source allowed for cooking, which not only made food more digestible, but also killed parasites and bacteria, dramatically improving nutrition and health. Third, a steady fire deterred large predators such as cave lions and wolves. The glow and crackle served as a nighttime barrier, giving the group a sense of security that would have been impossible with a fire that died out after a few hours. In short, the flint and pyrite spark, paired with carefully pre-charred tinder, was the prehistoric equivalent of a modern portable stove. It turned a momentary flash into a month-long hearth, giving Ice Age peoples the thermal stability they needed to survive the relentless cold and, ultimately, to thrive. How did our Ice Age ancestors manage to spend the long, brutal nights in caves without turning into frozen statues? The answer isn't a mystical ice bed spell, but a clever combination of engineering, natural insulation, and social teamwork that turned a cold, damp chamber into a surprisingly warm sleeping platform. First, the choice of spot mattered. Archaeologists have found repeated hearth clusters in the deepest parts of caves, where cold air sinks and wind is minimal. Early people would set up their sleeping areas downwind of the fire, often on a raised platform of stone slabs, broken bones, or packed earth. Those slabs acted like a primitive floor, keeping the body off the cold ground and the damp stone that would otherwise conduct heat away at a rate of up to 0.5 watts per square meter Kelvin. By interleaving layers of bark, moss, and animal hides between the stones, they added up to 5 centimeters of natural insulation, similar to the thickness of a modern sleeping pad. But the real genius was the dead air pocket. When they piled dry grass or shredded bark on the platform, they created a thin layer of trapped air. Air is a poor conductor, so those pockets reduced heat loss by up to 70%. Experiments with replica ice beds in Siberian permafrost show that a 10-centimeter layer of dry grass can keep a sleeping surface 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding floor, enough to prevent frostbite on exposed skin. Social behavior amplified the effect. Groups of 5 to 10 individuals would huddle, sharing body heat. The heat from the fire warmed the platform, while the collective warmth of the sleepers added another 1 to 2 degrees. In some sites, such as the Grotte du Lazaret in France, researchers have uncovered evidence of woven grass mats arranged in concentric circles, suggesting that people deliberately positioned themselves to maximize heat distribution. Finally, maintenance mattered. After a night's sleep, they would brush off wet moss, replace it with fresh, dry material, and sometimes spread a thin layer of animal fat over the platform to repel moisture. This simple waterproofing step prevented the insulation from becoming a cold, soggy blanket that would sap body heat. So the Ice Age ice beds weren't magic at all. They were a low-tech, evidence-backed system of insulation, airflow control, and communal warmth that allowed our ancestors to survive -40-degree nights in the heart of a stone womb. How could a hunter on a windswept tundra keep his kill from turning into a putrid mess when the temperature dropped to -40? The answer is surprisingly simple. They used the snow itself as a natural refrigerator, and the process may have given their guts a hidden boost. When a mammoth or reindeer fell on a frosty plain, the first instinct was to gut it quickly and haul the meat back to camp. But the exposed flesh would still bleed, and in the days before metal knives and airtight containers, the only way to stop bacterial growth was to plunge the meat into the surrounding snow or to wrap it in layers of animal hide and cover it with a thick snow blanket. The sub-zero environment freezes the surface within minutes, creating an ice crust that locks moisture inside and dramatically slows down the proliferation of spoilage microbes. Archaeologists have found cut marks on frozen megafauna bones in permafrost sites that line up with the timing of the last glacial maximum. Microscopic analysis of these bones shows remarkably low levels of collagen breakdown, suggesting that the meat stayed relatively fresh for weeks. Modern experiments confirm that freezing meat at -20 degrees or lower reduces the activity of psychrotolerant bacteria by more than 99%. But the story doesn't end with preservation. When early hunters finally thawed the meat over a fire or by leaving it in a shelter, the slow melt allowed ice crystals to rupture cell walls, releasing a concentrated broth of amino acids and minerals. Consuming this snow-cooked stock would have supplied a quick dose of sodium, potassium, and magnesium, essential electrolytes that counteract the dehydration caused by cold-induced diuresis. Moreover, the cold-induced freeze-thaw cycle may have acted like a primitive probiotic. Recent studies on modern frozen-thawed meat show that brief exposure to low temperatures can select for hardy, non-pathogenic bacterial strains that outcompete more dangerous microbes. If early humans ate meat that had been frozen and then gently thawed, they might have inadvertently seeded their gut with these resilient microbes, helping to maintain a balanced intestinal flora in an environment where fresh vegetables were scarce. Scientists still debate how significant this gut-boosting effect was, but the evidence points to a clever synergy. The snow kept the meat from rotting, and the thawed broth delivered both nutrition and a modest microbial inoculation that could have helped early peoples stay healthy during the harshest months of the Ice Age. How did a hunter-gatherer in a glacial world stop a bleeding leg when there was no clinic around the corner? The answer isn't a magic potion, but a toolbox of practical tricks that our ancestors honed over thousands of years: bone setting, plant bandages, pressure points, and fire cauterization. When a spearman fell from a cliff or a mammoth hunter was ripped by a saber-toothed cat, the first thing the group did was apply pressure. Thick, woven cords made from deer sinew or plant fibers were wrapped tightly around the wound, much like a modern tourniquet. Archaeologists have found dozens of preserved sinew cords in cave sites dating to 30,000 years before present, and experimental work shows they can stop arterial bleeding in under a minute. If the injury involved a broken bone, the healer, usually an elder with many years of hands-on experience, would first align the fragments by feel. Fossil evidence from the Shanidar Neanderthal site includes a healed femur with a distinctive U-shaped callus, indicating that a deliberate splint was applied and the bone set correctly. The splint itself was often a straight branch, padded with bark or moss and tied with plant twine. Experiments with replica splints show they can immobilize a fracture long enough for natural healing, even in sub-zero temperatures. Plants played a starring role in wound care. The bark of willow contains salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. Crushing the bark and spreading the pulp on a cut reduced clotting time and inflammation. In the alpine regions, archaeobotanical residues reveal the use of birch sap and yarrow leaves, both rich in tannins that help contract blood vessels. When the healer mashed the leaves into a paste and pressed it onto the wound, the tannins acted like a primitive coagulant, sealing the cut in minutes. For deeper lacerations, the group sometimes resorted to cauterization. A hot stone, heated in the fire for several minutes, was pressed against the wound to seal blood vessels and kill bacteria. Charcoal fragments found in Upper Paleolithic hearths bear microscopic scorch marks that match this practice. While painful, the method bought precious time in an environment where infection could be fatal within days. Finally, antiseptic hygiene was not a modern invention. Before treating a wound, the healer would rinse it in meltwater collected from ice or snow, which, despite its low temperature, is surprisingly effective at flushing out debris. Some groups also boiled water over a low flame and added crushed pine resin, creating a mild antibacterial wash. So, long before the first apothecary, ancient humans possessed a surprisingly sophisticated medical kit. Pressure-applying sinew cords, splints crafted from branches, plant-based coagulants, and fire-based cauterization. All of these techniques are documented by bone fossils, where pattern tools and chemical residues, and they show that survival in the Ice Age depended as much on clever wound care as on hunting the next mammoth. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep the nighttime wolves from turning a quiet campsite into a bloodbath? The answer isn't a high-tech alarm system, but a clever combination of human vigilance, simple stone tripwires, and the strategic use of the oldest members of the group. When the sun dipped below the snow-capped horizon, the hunters didn't just collapse into a heap of frozen limbs. Archaeologists have found evidence of designated night guards, usually the strongest, most experienced men, and often a few seasoned women, who took turns keeping watch from a raised platform of logs or a shallow pit lined with animal hides. The platform gave them a dry, slightly elevated spot that stayed above the cold ground, while the hides insulated them from the wind. A night guard would spend a few hours on duty, then swap with a rested companion, ensuring that at any moment at least one pair of eyes was scanning the dark for movement. To augment human senses, many Upper Paleolithic sites contain rows of carefully placed stones, sometimes sharpened on one edge, arranged in a loose line around the fire pit. If a wolf stepped on them, the stones would clatter and echo across the icy valley, alerting the sleepers. Experiments by experimental archaeologists have shown that a single stone can produce a sharp clack loud enough to travel several meters even in a blizzard, giving the camp a primitive but effective alarm. The fire itself was another layer of protection. A continuously fed hearth not only provided heat, but also a bright, flickering barrier that wolves instinctively avoided. Charcoal remnants and ash layers at sites like the Kostenki and Dolny Vestanis settlements show that fires were kept burning through the night, often fed by a slow burn pit of damp wood that released smoldering embers for hours. Elders played a surprisingly active role, too. Their deep knowledge of animal behavior meant they could predict when wolves were likely to roam, often just after a fresh kill was processed. They would position themselves near the perimeter, using long, hollowed bone whistles or simply a low, guttural chant that resonated through the snow, startling any approaching predator. The sound acted like a low-frequency alarm, heard far better than a human voice in the still, cold air. Finally, the layout of the camp itself was a defensive design. Dwellings were clustered in a semi-circular pattern with the fire pit at the center, and the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind. This forced any predator to approach from a direction where the guard could spot it first, and where the wind would carry the fire's smoke outward, masking the camp's scent. So, while there were no motion detectors or metal fences, Ice Age peoples used a layered system of human vigilance, stone tripwires, continuous fire, and the strategic wisdom of elders to keep the wolves at bay. The result was a night that, despite 30-degree below zero temperatures, remained surprisingly safe for those who knew how to work together. How did a handful of wrinkled hunters keep an entire clan alive when the wind howled at -40 degrees and food was as scarce as a warm day in the Pleistocene? The answer lies not in brute strength, but in the quiet, hard-won knowledge that only the elders could carry. First, the older members were the keepers of the seasonal calendar, a mental ledger etched into memory long before anyone could write on bone. By observing the subtle shifts in daylight, the migration patterns of reindeer, and the timing of wild plant emergence, they could predict when the ice sheets would retreat enough to expose fresh tundra. That foresight meant the group could plan their movements months in advance, avoiding the dead zone where game was gone and frostbite claimed the unwary. Second, elders possessed a sophisticated understanding of fire maintenance techniques that younger hunters simply hadn't mastered. Archaeologists have found charred layers in deep cave hearths that show a progression. First, a base fire kept smoldering under a mound of insulated ash, then a flare-up when a fresh spark was needed. The elders' hands, calloused from years of handling hot stones and dry tinder, could coax a spark from flint-napped chert with a consistency modern experiments still struggle to duplicate. By teaching the youngsters how to tend these base fires, they ensured that a warm core survived even the longest night. Third, the seniors were the tribe's physicians, albeit very rudimentary ones. Cut marks on mammoth ribs indicate that older members used bark fibers, moss, and even the resin of birch to dress wounds, a practice inferred from ethnographic parallels with modern Siberian hunters. They also knew which herbs could staunch bleeding or reduce infection. For example, leaves of willow contain salicin, a natural pain reliever. While we can't be sure how effective these treatments were, the fact that some Pleistocene sites contain adult skeletons with healed fractures suggests the knowledge was enough to keep people alive long enough to rejoin the hunt. Finally, the psychological role of elders cannot be ignored. In a climate where a single misstep could mean death, the presence of an experienced voice provided a calming, decision-making anchor. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups show that older individuals often mediate conflicts and allocate tasks, reducing the risk of reckless behavior that could expose the whole group to predators or exposure. The same likely applied 30,000 years ago. When a sudden blizzard rolled in, the elder would order the group to hunker down, consolidate fire, and ration supplies, rather than let panic drive them into the open. So the deep freeze wasn't won by the strongest arm, but by the collective memory, firecraft, medicinal lore, and steady leadership of those who had already survived several winters. Their wisdom turned a fragile band of hunters into a resilient, adaptable community, proving that in the Ice Age, age truly was an asset, not a liability.